Victoria. Minister Bruce Ralston is in Vancouver. We will start things off with Premier.
Great. Thanks, George, and thanks everyone for being here on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations. I'm joined by Minister Bruce Ralston in Vancouver, and he'll be coming up at the end of my remarks. But firstly, I just want to provide an update about what British Columbia has been doing to respond to COVID-19. We are now into the latter part of the second month, into the third month of our response, and we've been working hard every day to ensure that we're protecting existing jobs and looking at ways to create new jobs, and that's what Bruce and I will be talking about in a moment. Before we get there, I think everyone is anxiously looking forward to the Victoria Day long weekend, looking forward to, as of tomorrow, visiting some of our provincial parks to go for a day walk and visit some place near your home. Phase 2 of our restart plan begins at the end of the long weekend, starting on Tuesday. But before we get there, I want to remind everyone of Dr. Henry's appeal and reminder that we are far from out of the woods. COVID-19 is still here. Although we have flattened the curve, although we have seen very encouraging numbers day by day in terms of new cases, in terms of the number of people who have recovered from the disease, almost 78% of those who have contracted COVID-19 are now recovered. That's spectacular news, but sadly 130 people have lost their lives, and we need to be mindful that it was the efforts of all British Columbians that got us into this position that we can slowly and steadily reopen our economy so that all of us can enjoy the benefits and wonders of British Columbia. So over this long weekend, we need to hold the line. We need to remember that we need to avoid all non-essential travel, and of course the golden rules of washing our hands, staying a good physical distance from people, and of course stay home if you're sick. We have been fighting the virus. We should not be fighting ourselves. We need to make sure we're focused together collectively on coming through this better off than we were when we started. We need to support people, we need to support businesses, and we need to plan carefully for the restart. Today, Cabinet met and renewed BC's state of emergency for another 2 weeks. We did so that we can continue to keep people healthy and keep people safe, and the state of emergency will remain in place for the foreseeable future. We renew it every 2 weeks based on the evidence we see from Dr. Henry and in the broader community. Today I want to talk about the next phase of our restart, and that is ensuring that we're creating new opportunities and new jobs. We've seen during this period the development of many new tech jobs. I think of the Thrive Health Thrive app that has now been seen by millions and millions of people, all developed right here in British Columbia as a response to COVID-19. Today we're releasing our plan to clean up orphaned and inactive wells in northern British Columbia. This is an environmental stain on British Columbia. It's been reported on by the Auditor General, repeatedly calling on British Columbia and the industry to clean up its act. And today I'm happy to say, with a $120 million injection of funds from the federal government as part of their COVID-19 response, a welcome investment, we will be able to continue the cleanup of orphaned wells. The legislation that we passed last year put us in a good position to start this process. We'll be able to protect our environment and fight climate change. The funding that's announced today will help us decommission, reclaim, or restore more than 2,000 orphaned or inactive wells. Communities in the north will help us nominate which areas are in highest need, and we'll be able to put to work over 1,200 British Columbians in the north, contractors who will be developing the plan to do this remediation work to restore or reclaim these wells. I believe it's a good example of what can happen when governments work together. Federal, provincial, and local governments focusing on the challenges that people have in their communities and putting dollars to work, creating employment, and more importantly, creating a sound environment for us to continue on. And with that, I'd like to pass the microphone on to Bruce Ralston in Vancouver, and he'll pick up the details of our plan to restore, reclaim, or renew 2,000 orphaned or failed wells.
Minister Ralston.
Minister Ralston, over to you. Great. Thanks very much, Premier Horgan, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me acknowledge that here at the Vancouver Cabinet offices, we're on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. As the Premier mentioned, we are taking steps to support jobs for BC workers in oil and gas service companies as we clean up the environment and help restart the economy. These measures complement the province's COVID-19 plan and announcements by the federal government to help workers and businesses. This could not have been done without the support of the federal government, who recently announced this $120 million in funding for British Columbia to support the cleanup of oil and gas wells. With that funding, today we are launching 3 programs to tackle this: the Dormant Sites Reclamation Program, the Orphan Sites Supplemental Reclamation Program, and the Legacy Sites Reclamation Program. Let me explain a little bit about those 3 programs. First, the Dormant Sites Reclamation Program will make $100 million available to clean up dormant wells. A dormant well is one that has been active for 5 years in a row and is extremely unlikely to be returned to service. Secondly, the Orphan Sites Supplemental Reclamation Program will provide $15 million to clean up orphan wells where the operator is insolvent, no longer exists, or cannot be located. In other words, the responsibility has fallen to the provincial government. This program will be administered by the Oil and Gas Commission and will be in addition to the $27 million in planned work for 2020-2021. Finally, the Legacy Sites Reclamation Program will provide $5 million to support the legacy impacts of historic oil and gas activity. These are areas that continue to have environmental impacts, such as on wildlife habitat or traditional use by Indigenous peoples. Of the 25,000 oil and gas well sites in British Columbia, approximately 357 are considered orphan. There are currently 7,685 dormant well sites in British Columbia that need to be cleaned up. We estimate that these new programs will support upwards of 1,200 jobs in the oil and gas services sector while accelerating the restoration of more than 2,000 orphan and inactive wells. Funding will be provided directly to British Columbia field service companies and local contractors, putting British Columbians back to work. As well, Indigenous communities, local governments, and landowners will be able to nominate dormant, orphan, and legacy sites for priority consideration for decommissioning, reclamation, or restoration. By tackling restoration at those sites, we are moving one step closer to achieving our Clean BC goals for a cleaner, better future for all British Columbians. These programs also come at a time when we begin to restore the economy through the BC Restart Plan. They are good news for workers and communities in the northeast region of our province, for the environment, and for our economy during these challenging times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Ralston. To begin the Q&A, we're going to start with Tanya Fletcher from CBC. Tanya, your line is now open.
Hi, Premier. I'm hoping you can accommodate a bit of a 2-for-1 here. Firstly, looking at the U.S. border, what kind of pressure will you be putting on our federal government to keep it open beyond May 21st to non-essential travel, especially if the Prime Minister is facing equal pressure stateside to reopen it? And secondly, you'd said last week the province was not contemplating teacher layoffs. We're now hearing nearly 200 teachers have been laid off in Coquitlam alone, largely due to a drop in international student enrollment. So what is the current situation, and could there be any relief for teachers or districts?
Well, firstly, I'll start with the end of your 2-parter, Tanya, and with respect to education, how we're going to finish the 2019-2020 year and how we're looking forward to the year ahead. Minister Fleming and I will be having a statement on Friday, so I'd ask you to hold that question or re-ask it again when Minister Fleming is here. We believe that we have reached a collective agreement with the BC Teachers Federation, a freely bargained agreement, the first time that's happened in a long, long while. We're very excited about the partnership in the school sector, the K-12 sector, whether it be with trustees, superintendents, teachers, parents, support workers, and we're very much looking forward to doing a trial run in the weeks ahead as we come to the end of this year and looking to how we can build for more success in the year ahead. We do not contemplate job loss as a result of that, quite the contrary. As we look at new models, we're going to probably see an increase in a requirement for teachers and support staff. Challenges about international students are very real, but I think it's premature to talk about the impact of what that might mean here in May when we're talking about the school year in September. So I'd ask you to hold that question if I haven't given you enough already, and Rob and I will have a more comprehensive answer on how that would fit into a broader plan later in the week. When it comes to the border, I've been very clear with the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister that British Columbia is absolutely firm on the need to enforce a non-essential travel prohibition when it comes to people coming into Canada from somewhere else, particularly if they're coming into British Columbia. That position is supported by other premiers across the country, specifically Francois Legault in Quebec and Doug Ford in Ontario. So the three most populous provinces have a pretty firm view on this. The Prime Minister absolutely understands that. He absolutely understands the health requirement, but he has to manage a whole host of issues. I'll leave that to him to do, but he knows absolutely what my view is. I don't have to tell him again.
Next, we have Richard Zussman, Global News. Richard, your line is now open.
Premier, what are the thoughts being given to supports for the tourism industry as we move towards this weekend where the message clearly is do not travel? How do you look beyond that towards the summer? Will there be incentives for British Columbians to spend tourism dollars in British Columbia to help both people who have lost their jobs, but also help the industry that has suffered terribly through this?
That's a very, very good question, and one of the most hardest hit industries coming into the COVID-19 crisis, of course, was tourism, depending on people coming from away largely to provide revenues and jobs in communities right around British Columbia. I've said repeatedly, every corner of British Columbia is spectacular. There's every reason to assume that international travelers and those from across North America would want to come to BC and participate in ecotourism activities, do some whale watching, surfing on the beaches, visit Barkerville. The list is endless. And tourism has been a vital part of the BC economy and will continue to be a vital part in the future. Obviously, we're challenged by a prohibition on international travel. That's going to have a significant impact. We brought forward a host of initiatives under the leadership of Carol James to support businesses, all businesses. That includes the tourism sector. And we will be, as we get into the restart plan and stimulating more activity, be focusing on aggressive marketing through Destination BC to promote staycations here in BC, to encourage people to visit some of the tourism outlets we have here that are desperate for that business. I know people want to support local industry. I know people will want to visit parts of British Columbia that maybe have been on the list to do, but they've never been able to find the time to get that done. Now may well be the time. After we get through the weekend, after we see continued positive results, we'll see a reopening of our tourism sector, and more British Columbians will be traveling. More Canadians will likely be coming from other parts of the country. But it's really difficult to talk about how we're going to deal with July and August and September when we're right in the heart of May and we're trying to give the message to British Columbians that we're not there yet. Our restart plan going into phase 2 does not begin until next week. I'm reluctant to talk about the programs that we'll be putting in place for the tourism industry before then, because for now, we want people to stay close to home. So that's the message I'd like to deliver through your media outlet. Stay home as best you can for the foreseeable future, and as the summer unfolds and the evidence predicts that we can do more, we will do more, and we'll be focusing on the tourism sector for sure.
Next, we have Justine Hunter, Globe and Mail. Justine, please go ahead.
Thanks, George. Premier, you've spoken about the working conditions in the poultry plants that have had COVID outbreaks, and you look across the country, there's this consistent theme about issues in meat packing plants. The Federal Food Inspection Agency tells me their job is to ensure the safety of the food. So which arm of government is something to reform these workplaces?
Justine, you dropped out right on the point of your question. Sorry, can you ask it again?
Okay, I'll try that again. So the Federal Food Inspection Agency says it's not their job. Their job is to make sure the food's safe. So which arm of government needs to do something to reform these workplaces?
Well, I think it's a national responsibility, and I don't say that we're just dumping it on the federal government. Obviously, it's a food inspection agency that ensures that the food that comes out of processing facilities is safe for consumption. That's their core responsibility. I don't dispute that. But I would suggest that if people are hired by governments, provincial or federal, to ensure the health and safety of what goes on inside a plant, that part and parcel of that would be to identify or flag, particularly during a pandemic, when they see workers that may not be well enough to be in the workplace. We have said here in British Columbia, under the leadership of Dr. Henry, if you are sick, do not go to work. And that's all well and good if you have a collective agreement that has sick days, or your employment contract in the non-union sector, your arrangement with your employer provides for sick days. But many, many workers in British Columbia do not have those protections. And why I've raised this at the national level is we need to address it. And I'm hopeful that the federal government will work with me and other premiers to find a way forward where we can share the responsibility, but we need to send a message to every corner of the country that you should not go to work if you're ill, and we should protect you from economic consequences if you make that right choice. Too many people feel obliged to go to work because it's an economic imperative. We need to remove that imperative and also encourage people to do the right thing. I believe that's a national responsibility to lead, and I will support the Prime Minister in that initiative.
Next, we have Vaughn Palmer, Vancouver Sun. Vaughn, your line is now open.
Good day, Premier. Your government is scheduled tomorrow to sign a memorandum of understanding with the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en, despite the objections of the elected chiefs, some of them anyway, who say it's not a valid memorandum of understanding, and they've asked you to withdraw it. Are you concerned you're setting a precedent here by siding with the hereditary chiefs over the democratically elected ones?
No, I don't. I don't think we're setting a precedent, Vaughn, other than the precedent of sitting down and working with leadership within a community that has clearly divided. Leadership on the hereditary side that brought forward groundbreaking court action through Delgamuukw that has not yet been fully resolved. I absolutely respect the role and function of the elected leaders within the Wet'suwet'en territory. I don't believe all of the 6 band councils have had something directly to say about the MOU. But what we do know is the Wet'suwet'en have to figure this out themselves. How they govern themselves is up to them. That's been a tenet of how we proceeded as a government. We look to the Silcoteen decision as an example of rights and title being demonstrated with a map of territory, and that's the foundation and the framework, the blueprint, if you will, of how we believe we should proceed. We need to have a resolution to the governance challenges in Wet'suwet'en territory, but more importantly, the Wet'suwet'en need to have that resolution. I was hopeful that the clan gatherings to discuss the MOU would have been the opportunity for that. Clearly, it hasn't been perfect, but I believe the framework that's inside the MOU will allow that governance debate to take place internally, and the Wet'suwet'en will, as they rightly should, decide how they proceed from here. I don't think it's picking sides, Vaughn. I think it's addressing the issues we had on the table 2.5 months ago with the hereditary leaders. Those that are elected have their point of view. It's a legitimate point of view. I'm not disputing that at all. But I think the Wet'suwet'en people have to figure it out, elected, non-elected, and just regular folks. And I believe the MOU will allow for that.
Lisa Yuzda, News 1130.
Hello, Premier. Speaking about opening up into next week, hearing from people anxiety, concerns, that people are hearing this date, their business owners, their bosses are hearing this May 19th, and they're feeling the pressure to get back to work. They're hearing from the bosses pressure to get back to work, and the anxiety is mounting, but they're not seeing the guidelines that they feel they need to see to know that it's being done safely. And yes, there are legal avenues that people can take if their employer is being, for lack of a better term, a jerk and pushing them. But this is a really hard time to press legal matters or press your boss. So what kind of, I guess, assurances can the province give to people who are feeling unsure going forward, who are feeling they're not seeing the guidelines to make these personal decisions while feeling pressure from their company?
Well, certainly I respect and understand the anxiety that people are feeling, whether it's about return to work, whether it's about an opening up of the economy, whether it's about more people traveling within British Columbia and coming through town who have not been in town for a while or from away, as they say in the Maritimes. I understand that anxiety, but I said very clearly last week that this is not the flick of a switch. We are beginning phase 2 of the restart next week. That does not mean that every hairstylist, every restaurant, every massage physio or chiropractic service will be opened on a particular day. It's when we start that process. WorkSafe BC and the Public Health Office will have guidelines later in the week or perhaps even into early next week. I don't want to press them to do an unsatisfactory job. They've been working on this for a number of weeks now, and we can expect to see those guidelines within the next few days. But I don't want people to believe that on the 19th of May, all of a sudden we're back to normal. We are not going to be back to normal. We're going to start the process to bring back industries that were ordered shut by Dr. Henry, and she'll be revising her orders at the appropriate time. I think people have a right to be concerned. I don't doubt that for one second, but we're doing our level best to make sure we're keeping people safe, and we're making sure that we're building the confidence that we need for people to go back into the shops and the various places that they used to frequent, to put down their dollars, to help those businesses survive, to create jobs, and to get us back to what will be the new normal.
Next, we have Rob Buffum, CTV. Rob, go ahead.
Hi, Premier. Thanks for your time. My question is sort of related. The province had announced that medical services, or people could expect that medical services like dental and physio would be back, starting May 19th. I just spoke to a dentist who said dentists in the province heard last night that there were no guidelines at all in place at this point, and it's my understanding that physiotherapists are in the same situation. So I'm wondering, what's your message for dentists, for example, who are anxious to get back to work? What's the holdup? And I guess, is it realistic for people who want to see their physiotherapist or dentist next Tuesday to actually do so?
Well, first of all, again, following on the answer I just gave, I don't think people should expect that come next Tuesday, everything's going to be back the way it was. And the holdup is we want to make sure we get it right. WorkSafe and public health officials are finalizing the details on the guidelines for regulated medical services, for example, dentistry, chiropractic services, in face-to-face counseling, and so on. Those guidelines will be ready, and for those practitioners who are awaiting those guidelines, I think they can take some fairly educated guesses on how they can protect their patients, how they can protect hygienists and other dental assistants, to put in place the parameters that make them comfortable as healthcare providers to deliver that service. And if they're waiting for WorkSafe to tell them how best to do that, then they'll be waiting until the regulations are the guidelines are in place. But I think the vast majority of healthcare providers in these areas that are regulated by the province understand what we're talking about here, and they're going to be working as hard as they can to make their patients and their workforce comfortable. And I look forward to visiting all of these businesses once we get to a place where the guidelines are up and they can operate safely.
Next, we have Farhan Malji, TSN. Farhan, please go ahead.
Thanks for taking my question, Premier. We understand that you had a meeting with NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman, or a call at least, earlier today. I wanted to ask just how that went, what the next steps are between British Columbia and the National Hockey League on the possibility of a hub city, and are you confident that an arrangement can be made where the protocols are that satisfy the provincial government?
Thanks, Farhan, for the question. I think it's the first TSN question I've had at a podium. I appreciate that. I did talk to Commissioner Bettman yesterday. Later in the day, his assistant Bill Daly was on the call as well, along with the minister responsible for sport here in BC, Lisa Bair. We had a wide-ranging discussion about our desire in British Columbia to support the NHL and the Vancouver Canucks, who have been initiating these discussions with governments, to see if we could put in place a framework where the NHL could either use Vancouver as a hub city in part of the many plans that are floating around out there. You've covered many of them, Farhan, about the Pacific Division having a hub. Mr. Bettman and his team recognize that British Columbia has had a pretty positive response to COVID-19, in terms of flattening the curve. Mr. Bettman also knows that this is a hockey crazy province. We'd be happy to have hockey take place here so that we could see current games on our televisions. But there are obstacles obviously in the way. A 14-day isolation period would be required effective today. Where we are in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks is up to Dr. Henry and how she feels we're doing at managing the curve as we restart the economy. But Mr. Bettman was well aware of that, as are the NHL Players Association representatives, who are focused on making sure that players are safe. And of course, the NHL is concerned about players and the communities that they operate in. I believe we're in a good place to host. That's why I contacted the commissioner. The Canucks have been working very cooperatively with my minister. We've heard from others around the league that have other ideas about perhaps having all of the games played in British Columbia. We have WHL rinks in Victoria, in Kamloops, in Kelowna, in Prince George. The Kootenays have in Cranbrook has an outstanding facility as well. We have hotel space. So the sky's really the limit. I wanted to let the commissioner know that British Columbia stands ready to assist in looking at a plan brought forward by the players and the NHL. And if we can make it work, I think that would be great for BC and it would be great for the NHL.
Next, we have Andrew McLeod. Andrew, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Premier. The Union of BC Municipalities is asking to have the property tax deferral program expanded so it covers, they say, at least all residential owners. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that and what direction we might see from the government.
Thanks, Andrew, for the question. We have been working, Minister James and I, to try and find ways to ensure that we're keeping people as whole as we can during this very, very difficult time. We're looking forward to proposals from UBCM and others about how we can better support landowners, homeowners, communities. The sky is really the limit on the requests, but it's not necessarily the limit on our ability to meet those demands. We've been working with the federal government to try and fill gaps as they bring forward programs, and we're working as hard as we can to keep people going through this difficult time. And as we go through the restart, if there are still gaps, we're going to try our best to fill them. But I have not yet seen the memorandum you talk about. When I see it, I'll have more to say. But I know Carol James has got proposals stacked on her desk, and she and her staff are going through them diligently, trying to find those that will fit and those that will give the best bang for our tax dollars to support people and businesses.
Mary Griffin, CHEK News, please go ahead.
Very much. I just have a question relating to Vancouver Island and natural resources, and I'm wondering, do you support more government action, including temporary relief on federal log exports, to help stimulate the Vancouver Island log export sector?
Log exports are a very divisive issue on Vancouver Island and indeed across British Columbia. In many cases, the federal regulations apply to private lands, and for those Vancouver Islanders watching here on CHEK, they'll know that the ENN land grant, which is now operated by Mosaic, the company that operates those lands, they're characterized as private lands, but the vast majority of Vancouver Islanders assume that all of Vancouver Island is Crown land and subject to provincial responsibility. So it's a divisive issue, and it's an issue that's not well understood. I believe we should get as much value out of our logs as possible, whether they come from private land or they come from our Crown land, whether it be here on the island or across British Columbia. And I think the vast majority of British Columbians, as they look at log prices, as they look at lumber prices, and the significant decline in demand as a result of COVID-19, that the best way forward is to make sure that we steward those resources in the best interest of this generation and future generations.
For our last question, we have Victor Kaiser, Radio NL. Victor, please go ahead.
Hi, Premier. Thanks for taking this question. Just was curious, a couple things really, whether the province has any plans perhaps to look for PPE for some of the businesses that might be opening. I know some cities like Kamloops are looking to see if they can acquire some PPE and potentially give that to businesses looking to open the doors, and as well if there's plans to maybe extend some of the benefits, whether it's the rental benefit or some income assistance perhaps to people that are still working but have taken pay cuts or maybe out a second job and out some significant amount of money. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, firstly, on the rent supplement, BC is the only province that put in place a program for April, May, and into next month, into June. And we're going to revisit that at the end of that time and see where we're at. We don't know yet how far we'll have to go, how quickly the economy will respond to the restart. And it's not just about us, of course. It's about, as a small trading economy, we need to make sure that our trading partners, whether they be Canadian, American, or international, are also starting up with the same level of success that we hope to see. So we're one cog in a large machine, and we need to make sure that our trading partners are keeping pace with us so that we can provide the products that have benefited British Columbians for so many years. With respect to finding new programs, again, Minister James has not ruled out anything. Whenever there's a proposal that comes forward, she and her team analyze it and see if that's the best bang for buck that we can possibly get. With respect to PPE, we have created a hub through the Minister of Jobs and Enterprise, Jobs, Economy, and JEDC, Michelle Mongal. And there's a hub, a PPE hub, so that we can find places and ways to get local businesses to create the PPE, put it through the system so we can get it to frontline workers. We're now looking at taking that, if we have a surplus of PPE, and pushing it through to the private sector. So it's a very good idea. More and more businesses, as they look at restarting, are looking at how they can use PPE to ensure their employees are safe, but more importantly, to demonstrate to their customers that they take these issues very seriously. And that will require a significant amount of PPE, and we're looking at ways that we can support businesses as we do that.
Thanks very much. This concludes today's press conference.